Hi, I'm Hobie-Wan. This is Red Chair Reading. Glasses, check. We are reading The Tower Treasure, Hardy Boys, number 1. In this video, I'm just going to read chapter 18. Put me on a shelf, do some dishes, fold your laundry. Let's go. A startling deduction. Duck! Frank ordered in a hoarse whisper, quickly dropping to the ground. Instantly, Joe threw himself face down alongside his brother. You think the person with the flashlight in the tower saw us? Frank asked. He could have, but maybe not. We sure went down fast. The strong flashlight was not trained on them again. It was beamed out a window of the tower in another direction, then turned off. Well, what say? Joe asked. Shall we go on up to the mansion and continue our sleuthing? Frank was of the opinion that if they did, they might get into trouble. Even if they had not been recognized, the person in the tower probably had spotted them. I'd like to find out who was in the tower, Joe argued. It's just possible that the Applegates don't know anything about him. Frank laughed quietly. Don't let your imagination run away with you, he advised. As the boys debated about whether to leave the grounds or go forward, the matter was suddenly taken out of their hands. From around the corner of the tower rushed a huge police dog, growling and barking. It apparently had scented the brothers and was bounding directly toward them. Frank and Joe started to run pell-mell, but were unable to keep ahead of the dog. In a few moments, he blocked their path menacingly and set up a ferocious barking. I guess we're caught, Frank said, and I hope this old fellow won't take a piece out of my leg. The two boys tried to make friends with the animal, but he would not let them budge. Well, what do we do now? Joe asked in disgust as the dog continued to growl menacingly. Wait to be rescued, Frank replied tersely. A moment later, they saw a bobbing light coming in their direction, and presently Mr. Applegate appeared. He looked at the boys in complete astonishment. You fellows never give up, do you? He remarked. What have you been doing? More digging? The brothers did not reply at once. They were embarrassed to have been discovered, but relieved that the man did not suspect what they had really intended to do. The owner of Tower Mansion took their lack of response to mean he was right. I'm just not going to have any more of my grounds ruined, he said gruffly. I've borrowed this watchdog, Rex, and he'll be going to keep everybody away. That's what he's going to do. If you have any reason for wanting to see me, you'd better phone first, and I'll keep Rex chained. Who was up in the tower with a flashlight? Frank asked the elderly man. My sister. She got it into her head that maybe she was smarter than you fellows and could find the stolen stuff in the old tower. But she didn't. Frank and Joe suppressed grins as he went on. And then Adelia decided to flash that high-powered flashlight around the grounds, thinking we might have a lot of curious visitors because of the publicity. Apparently, she picked you up. The boys laughed. Yes, she did, Frank admitted. Between her and Rex, I guess you needn't worry about any prowlers. Frank and Joe said goodnight to Herd Applegate and started down the driveway. This time, the dog did not follow them. He remained at the man's side until the Hardys were out of sight. As they trudged homeward, Joe remarked, This seems to be our day for exciting events that fizzle out like wet fireworks. Yes, nothing to show for all our hard work. At supper, both Mr. and Mrs. Hardy laughed at the boys' story of their encounter with the dog. Then they became serious when Frank asked his father if he thought there was a chance that the Applegates might be guilty of falsely reporting a robbery. It's possible, of course, the detective answered, but the Applegates are so well-to-do, I can't see any point in their trying such a thing. I believe it's best for us to stick to the original idea, that someone really did take the jewels and securities from the safe, and that the person was Jackley. As the boys were going to bed that night, Frank remarked to his brother, Tomorrow is Saturday, and we have the whole day free. I vote we set ourselves the goal of solving the mystery before night. A big order, but I'm with you, Joe replied with a grin. They were up early and began to discuss what course of sleuthing they should follow. I think we ought to start off in a completely new tack, Joe suggested. In what direction? Frank asked him. In the direction of the railroad. Joe went on to explain that the one thing they had not done was find out about Red Jackley's habits. when he had worked around Bayport. If they could talk to one or more persons who had known him, they might pick up some new clue, which would lead them to the stolen property. "Good idea, Joe," his brother agreed. "Let's take our lunch and make an all-day trip on our motorcycles." "Fine. Hey, if this is interesting to you, please hit the like button. It'll help the video spread to other people, and thank you very much. I appreciate that." Fine. Mr. Hardy had left the house very early, so his sons did not see him. When his wife heard the boys' plan, she thought it an excellent one and immediately offered to make some sandwiches for them. By the time they were ready to leave, she had 2 small boxes packed with a hearty picnic lunch. "Goodbye and good luck," Mrs. Hardy called as the brothers rode off. "Thanks, Mother, for everything," the young detectives chorused as they started off. When Frank and Joe reached Bayport Railroad Station, they questioned the station master and learned that he had been with the company only a year and had not known Red Jackley. "Did he work on a passenger train?" the man asked. "I don't know," Frank replied. "I believe he was employed as a maintenance man." "Then," said the station master, "I'll advise you to go out along the highway to the railroad crossings and interview a couple of old flagmen who are still around. Both of them seem to know everybody and everything connected with the railroad for the past 50 years. He chuckled. Okay, the boys knew of 2 grade crossings some miles out of town and now headed for them. At the first one, I just kicked the camera. Cool. At the first one, they learned that the regular flagman man was home, ill, and his substitute had never heard of Red Jackley. Frank and Joe went on. At the next crossing, they found old Mike Haley, the flagman there, busy at his job. His bright blue eyes searched their faces for a moment. Then he amazed them by saying, "You're Frank and Joe Hardy, sons of the famous detective Fenton Hardy. You know us?" Frank asked. "I must confess, I don't recall having met you before." "And you ain't," the man responded. "But I make it a rule to memorize every face I see in the newspapers. Never know when there's going to be an accident, and I might be called on to identify some people." The boys gulped at this gruesome thought. Then Frank asked Haley if he remembered a railroad man named Red Jackley. "I recollect a man named Jackley, but he wasn't never called Red when I knew him. I reckon he's the same fellow, though." "You mean the one that I read went to jail?" "That's the man." He out of the pen yet?" Mike Haley questioned. "He died," Joe replied. "Our dad is working on a case that has some connection with Jackley, and we're just trying to find out something about him." "Then what do you want to do?" said the flagman. "What you want to do is go down to the Bayport and Coastline Railroad. That's where Jackley used to work. He was around the station at Cherryville. That ain't so far from here." He pointed in a northerly direction. "Thanks a million," said Frank. "You've helped us a lot." The brothers set off on their motorcycles for Cherryville. When they came to the small town, a policeman directed them to the railroad station, which was about half a mile out of town. The rail station stood in a depression below a new highway, and was reached by a curving road which ran parallel to the tracks for several hundred feet. The building itself was small, square, and very much in need of paint. A few nearby frame buildings were in a bad state of disrepair. An old wooden water tank, about 70 yards from one side of the station house, sagged precariously. At the same distance, on the other side, rose another water tank. This one, painted red, was of metal and in much better condition. Frank and Joe parked their motorcycles and went into the station. A man in his shirt sleeves and wearing a green visor was bustling about behind the ticket window. "Are you the station master?" Frank called to him. The man came forward. "I'm Jake, station master and ticket seller and baggage slinger and express handler and mail carrier and janitor and even rice thrower. You name it, I'm your man." The boys burst into laughter. Then Joe said, "If there's anybody here who can tell us what we want to know, I'm sure it's you. But first, What do you mean you're a rice thrower? The station agent guffawed. Well, it don't happen often, but when a bride and groom comes down here to take a train, I just go out, grab some of the rice, and throw it along with everybody else. I reckon if that'll make 'em happy, I want to be part of the proceedings. Again, the Hardys roared with laughter. Then Frank inquired if the man had known Red Jackley. I sure did, Jake replied. Funny kind of fellow. Work like mad one minute, then loaf on the job the next. One thing about him, he never wanted nobody to give him any orders. Did you know that he died recently? Frank asked. No, I didn't, the station master answered. I'm real sorry to hear that. Jackley wasn't a bad sort when I knew him. Just got to keep in the wrong kind of company, I guess. Can you tell us any particular characteristics he had? Frank questioned. Jake scratched his head above his visor. Finally, he said, the thing I remember most about Jackley is that he was a regular monkey. He was nimble. He could be racing up and down freight car ladders. At that moment, they heard a train whistle, and the man said hurriedly, Gotta leave you now. Boys, come back some other time when I ain't so busy. Gotta meet this train. The Hardys left him and Frank suggested, let's eat our lunch and come back. They found a little grove of trees beside the railroad tracks and propped their motorcycles against a larger tree. I'm starved, said Frank, seating himself under the tree and opening his box of lunch. Boy, this is good, Joe exclaimed a moment later as he bit hungrily into a thick roast beef sandwich. Ooh, my favorite. I like mine with plenty of mayonnaise on sourdough with lettuce, tomatoes, and Swiss cheese. I wonder if that's how the Hardys' mom makes their sandwiches. If Jackley had only stayed with the railroad company, Frank observed as he munched a deviled egg. Yum, 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 yum. It would have been better for everyone. He sure caused a lot of trouble before he died, Joe agreed. And he's caused a lot more since, the way things have gone, for the Robinsons especially. The boys gazed reflectively down the tracks, gleaming in the sun. The rails stretched far into the distance. Only a few hundred feet from the place where they were seated, the Hardys could see both water tanks, the dilapidated, weather-beaten wooden one, with some of the rungs missing from the ladder that led up its side, and the squat metal tank perched on spindly legs. Frank took a bite of his sandwich and chewed it thoughtfully. The sight of the two water towers had given him an idea, but at first seemed to him too absurd for consideration. He was wondering whether or not he should mention it to his brother. When he noticed that Joe, too, was gazing intently down the tracks at the tanks, Joe raised a cookie to his lips, absently, attempted a bite, and missed the cookie altogether. Cookie, C-O-O-K-Y? Is that how we spell cookie? Still, he continued gazing fixedly in the same direction. I would call that kooky. Finally, Joe turned and looked at his brother. Both knew that they were thinking the identical thing. 2 water towers, Frank said in a low but excited tone. An old one and a newer one, Joe murmured, and Jackley said, he said the stuff in the old tower. He hid the stuff in the old tower. He was a railroad man. Why not? Joe shouted, springing to his feet. Why couldn't it have been this old water tower? He meant. He used to work around here. After all, he didn't say the old tower of Tower Mansion. He just said old tower. A ding! Frank, I believe we stumbled on a terrific clue, Joe said jubilantly. It would be the natural thing for Jackley to come to his former haunts after the robbery. Right, Frank agreed. And when he discovered that Chet's jalopy was gone, he probably thought that the police were hot on his trail, so he decided to hide the loot someplace he knew, where no one else would suspect. The old water tower. This must be the place. Well, I hope so, for the Hardys' sake. That is the end of chapter 18. Thank you for listening to my reading. I'm enjoying it. I hope you are. Be sure to hit that like button. I guess I asked that already. I'll see you in chapter 19. Bye.